Did you hear anything from the Times? I haven't received any. Let me close my door.
Oh, no.
I've been sending them the links, but haven't heard lately.
They say that they enjoy them very much and they're rude.
Okay.
I'll tell them that.
Oh, it's okay. I just want to make sure.
Well, they told us that they're enjoying it very much. This has been reported. Okay.
Okay, we are in the final section of the book of Zechariah. And this section kind of rushes through a bunch of things, but under one caption. Last week, I told you that there are two major oracles in Zechariah. We looked at the first one last week. This is the second, with the Hebrew titling Masa Devar Yahweh, and literally oracle word of Yahweh, but a better English would be an oracle, comma, a word of Yahweh. So this covers chapters 12, 13, and 14, the end of the book. The first thing we encounter as we enter here is that it's really geared around Jerusalem. Okay, the source of the message is from God, who is the creator. It says here, who stretched out the heavens, laid the foundations of the earth, formed the human spirit. It's a brief summary. Or here's some strong winds outside. Looks like some kind of rain is coming. And the second thing about the oracle is that it is about Jerusalem. I will make Jerusalem like an intoxicating drink. It talks about how the nations will be against Jerusalem, but they would end up like drunken men in a stupor in their desire to destroy Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes the embodiment of God's kingdom in these chapters, in this oracle. And in this oracle, we meet this phrase, Yom Ladonai, the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord. So anytime you see this expression, the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord, in the Hebrew Bible, and later on in the New Testament, it's not referring to Sabbath or any other day. It's referring to this eschatological, almost end of the world event when God finally acts to resolve everything that has been going wrong in human history. The oracle is peppered by this expression in Hebrew, Bayom Hahu, which is translated in that day or on that day, depending on your English translation. But basically, it's an eschatological expression. So God waits, but when God does something, that's Bayom Hahu. So it's a parallel but shorter expression of the previous one. And we have several things that God will do on that day. So in chapter 12, verse 3, the first thing is, I will make Jerusalem a heavy burden for all the nations. We're not sure exactly, because there's very little elaboration of these messages. They just kind of run through very quickly. But it is concerning this kingdom. So there will be, as we have seen in Ezekiel and Amos, this alliance of nations. I was just watching a video by a retired American Colonel, McGregor, who actually analyzes how an alliance is forming against Israel, comprised of Iran, Russia, Turkey as the immediate ring, along with their proxies in Arabia, in Yemen, and in Iraq, Lebanon, and then China off on the side. Almost the exact same scenario that Ezekiel paints. And so here, Zechariah is saying the other side of the coin, that Israel or Jerusalem will become a weight, a burden for these nations. Okay, and anyone who attacks Jerusalem, the Hebrew expression seriously injured is uncertain whether this is talking about the effects of war or disease or some kind of fighting, maybe a combination of things. And then God says, I will strike the horses of the nations. He tells us two things that reminds of Old Testament stories, confusion and blindness. We meet these with the Exodus story, but more particularly with the stories during the time of Elisha, and then later on with Hezekiah and Isaiah, when enemy armies came up against Jerusalem and were literally uh, confused, blinded, and killed by God. Also, the Assyrian siege and many of those battles. So he's drawing upon previous Old Testament events, historical events, to explain something in the future. So we are to look at history as a lens for eschatology, for the ending of the world. And then he says, I will make the leaders of Judah an igniter among sticks, a burning torch among sheaves. He's promising that these nations that will come against Israel will be burnt up. They will be just like sheaves in a flame. The story perhaps that really resonates with this is the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, how an angel of God came as a prayer of Hezekiah and single-handedly wiped out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. No wonder the Assyrians and Babylonians do not record, and Egyptians, these defeats, because they are so dramatic. And when you look at biblical history, a nation did not defeat Jerusalem unless designed by God. So God's design was for Nebuchadnezzar to defeat Jerusalem as a punishment for the apostasy and the idolatry of the nation, but not for the Assyrians. And so even though the Assyrians came before the Babylonians, they were able to take Samaria and defeat the northern kingdom, but they could not defeat Jerusalem. And so the southern kingdom of Judah remained intact. The Egyptians tried the same thing, but it wasn't God's will for the Egyptians to defeat Jerusalem, and so they could not. Nebuchadnezzar was able, and that's because God had designed for Judah to be sent to exile into Babylon. And so the defeats of Jerusalem that are recorded in biblical history come at the behest of God. They are part of his will. And this is important to understand. Here, he is suggesting that in Bayom Hahu, Jerusalem will come out on top. It doesn't matter how many nations, it doesn't matter if all the nations of the world come up against it, they will be defeated. When the Assyrians under Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, there was such starvation going on in the city of Jerusalem that some people, it's recorded, resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. And yet God says nothing will happen. This army that you see, Sennacherib's army even used psychological warfare against the city of Jerusalem. Even the kings of Judah were frightened by the Assyrians, but they were not defeated. With the Babylonians, a totally different story, because that was the will of God. And so the will of God here is that Jerusalem and its leaders, they will be the ones who will ignite this conflagration. Some people might see this as Israel being willing to use atomic weapons. It is kind of a known secret that the nation of Israel has at least 100, if not more, nuclear weapons, and that they may be willing to use them against Iran, against Hezbollah, if things get any worse than this. Who knows? If they really see the alliance of Turkey, Russia, and Iran taking on serious shape, then anything could happen. And so some people are seeing more into this as physical, literal fulfillment than just an eschatological one. Continuing with this Bayom Hahu, God says, I will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, just like he did with Sennacherib, just like he did against Egypt and many other empires that have come against. And then God states his intention: I will destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. The picture here is very similar, even though painted in different phraseology, as Ezekiel 38 and 39. And therein lies the difficulty for us. But tucked within this prophecy of Bayom Hahu, this oracle, is this little piece that was quoted by John. Well, parts of it were quoted by John and applied to the gospel. I will pour out the kingship of David and the population of Jerusalem, spirit of grace and supplication. They will look to me as the one they have pierced. John only takes this last part. They will look at me as the one they have pierced, and applies it to the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, in Zechariah, it goes into a very, very short lamentation. They will lament for him as one laments for an only son, and there will be bitter cry for him, like the first cry for a firstborn. Now, Zechariah's prophecy is partly messianic, but mostly eschatological. So we must expect greater fulfillment than just the messianic part. And maybe this is why John only picks up a piece of the prophecy and applied it to Jesus in John 19. This is at the crucifixion of Christ. And then it tells us that there'll be a great day of lamentation among Israel, because the war will bring trouble for the nation as well. And also because there will be people in Judah, in Jerusalem, who are still not faithful to God, and God will punish them along with the other nations. The oracle continues into the next chapter. He then talks about a fountain in Jerusalem, and the description of this fountain is a bit similar to Revelation's description of the New Jerusalem, but we'll get to that. It says, I will remove the names of the idols from the land, and they will never again be remembered. So the purging of idolatry, we know that historically that took place with the Babylonian Empire or the Babylonian exile. So maybe there's a bit of looking back at history. But then we have a messianic prophecy that is tied to this new messianic eschatological age. He talks about a true prophet who will emerge, a servant prophet. This fits in with passages like Isaiah 53, the servant songs in Isaiah 42, 49, and 50, and so on. And that this true prophet would be wounded in his friend's house. One of the most curious prophecies of Zechariah is this, that when this messianic prophet, this true prophet, sets up his kingdom, there will be people in that kingdom who have never heard the story of the cross. And so they walk up to this messianic prophet and ask him, what are these wounds on your sides? And he will say, these are the wounds I received in the house of my friends. That's chapter 13, verse 6. And then this true prophet will refine the survivors, giving rise to a very strong concept of remnant. The Hebrew word remnant simply means survivors. It's not about size. If the survivors are the majority, that's a remnant. If the survivors are the minority, that's remnant. And when you read the New Testament, this concept of remnant becomes really important. There is a scaling process until you get the final remnant in Revelation. In Revelation 12, when it talks about the remnants of the woman, the celestial woman, the Greek word there is similar to the Hebrew word. It means the survivors of that woman as well. And so we see some emerging theologies that could be picked up by the New Testament and elaborated at great point. And that is this messianic servant, his mission, and the concept of survivors or remnants, and the idea of salvation involving people who may not have had a chance to actually hear or know about the crucifixion of Christ or the story of the cross as we know it from the Gospels. It continues in chapter 14. The day of Yahweh is a day of war. And this is important for us to keep in mind, because this Yom Ladonai, this Bayom Hahu, is not a day of peace. It is probably what Jesus was referring to when he said, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. The final image of Christ in Revelation before the new earth and the 1,000-year vision in chapter 19 is of Jesus as a warrior riding a horse with this giant sword, and he is trampling the harvest, the wine harvest, and his robe is dripping with blood. It's a very bloody scene. This is not the same as the jihad concept of Islam, which implies that you must always be at war against those who do not worship Allah. This is a concept that God will be at war when he has given a people, a nation, a city, a planet enough time to change. So Bayom Hahu was applied with the Babylonian exile. So when they went into Babylon, that was Bayom Hahu. It's God waging war against Judah for their sins. And so he uses an enemy of war. Habakkuk wrestled with this problem. He questioned God as to why there was so much injustice, corruption, and violence in the nation of Judah, in the city of Jerusalem. And God says, I have a solution for you. And so Habakkuk is very interested. Habakkuk is pre-exilic. And he says, my solution is I'm bringing the Babylonians to solve all of this problem. And Habakkuk is doubly perplexed. God, how can you bring a nation that is even more evil than our own to do the solution? But that's what God says, that Babylon will be their sword. And here in Zechariah, it is Jerusalem that becomes his sword. Habakkuk was so perplexed by God's answers that he challenged God. He says, I'm going to climb up here on the wall. I'm going to stand here until you give me the correct answer. God never did. Habakkuk ended up writing a beautiful prayer psalm to celebrate the mysterious will, but the powerful working of God. It's a good thing to read in connection with this understand of Bayom Hahu. You see, Bayom Hahu is a day of war, but the purpose of the war is to purge, to cleanse, not to destroy. And so even the enemies will be provided a chance, as we shall see. And he says that on that day, Yahweh and his holy ones will descend on Mount Olives. And as they descend on Mount Olives, the mountain will split into this gigantic valley. Zechariah doesn't tell us why there would be a need for this gigantic valley. And holy ones here does not necessarily mean the angels. The only other vision anywhere in the Bible that parallels this is the New Jerusalem. Because we are told that the New Jerusalem will land somewhere in the vicinity of Mount Olives. Christ ascended from Mount Olives, and he told the disciples that he will return in the exact manner, implying in Greek the exact place from which he ascended, and that was Mount of Olives. So there are important prophecies about Mount of Olives, and these were enacted in the ministry of Jesus. His entrance into Jerusalem as king, riding a colt on that triumphal entry, started from the Mount of Olives down. His ascent into heaven, the Mount of Olives, when he returns with all the holy ones, that means all of the redeemed and angels in that gigantic holy city, it will land in the vicinity of the Mount of Olives. Of course, if we put Revelation and Zechariah together, a new real estate will open up. Now, why does Zechariah speak about the formation of this gigantic valley? Well, Revelation tells us how big the New Jerusalem will be. If the numbers are to be taken literally, then we have to understand that the New Jerusalem will be 2,200 kilometers long, 2,200 kilometers wide, and 2,200 kilometers high. It's a cube. It's the only cube that is not the holy place, the most holy place. The Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, in the Temple of Solomon, were cubes. And they were seen as the dwelling place of God, and so is the New Jerusalem. The Holy of Holies had no man-made artificial lights. Only the glory of God resided there. In the New Jerusalem, no sun, no moon, no day or night, because the glory of God shines in it. And so I believe that if you put these two prophecies together, you actually see a picture of that final event prior to the new creation, when Jesus and God, when the angels and all the redeemed will descend after 1,000 years on that very spot. Now, here's my conviction. I've been writing a paper, I'm still polishing it up, on why God gave that particular land to Abraham, and why the Messiah story had to happen there, and why all the wars, no piece of property has been fought over more than that area. Every empire of the world has tried to conquer that land. Call it Canaan in Old Testament early times, or Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, or what everybody wants to call Palestine these days. When you look at the rivers in Genesis that are associated with Eden, there are only 4 rivers in fairly close proximity to each other that fit the description. And so I believe that that land given to Abraham was the original Garden of Eden. Yes, people will say the flood changed the topography, but surely God knows where it originally was. So restarting the plan of salvation through Abraham, that's the place. So when Jesus came, he also came there. Everything took place there. When he comes back, these prophecies says, before the new creation, it will be reestablished there. As John Milton wrote, paradise lost, paradise regained. I don't think he understood that theology of land. And this is why the land is at once the most cursed and the most blessed land in biblical history. And so if this city is for real, 2,000 kilometers length, breadth, and height, it's going to need a ginormous place in which to land. 2,200 kilometers on one side is almost the entire length of Thailand. And imagine, not many countries can accommodate this, especially Middle East countries, if that's where the Garden of Eden really was. And then another parallel to Isaiah's vision and Revelation vision about the same thing, that in this new reality, there will be no light source, but continuous day, no night. There are only 3 places in the Bible where we find this concept, and all 3 of them are prophecies. The first time it's in Isaiah 60, in describing the transformation of Jerusalem. The second time in Zechariah, in talking about this new transformed Jerusalem. The third time in Revelation, also about the new Jerusalem that comes down from heaven. So same source, same prophecy, same reality. A world, kingdom of God that is continuous day, because the presence of God is all light. There is no darkness in him, as the Bible says. And in verse 8 of chapter 14, we have something that appears in Genesis, in Zechariah, and in Revelation 21. Living waters will flow out from Jerusalem. This is a prophecy that is cited directly in Revelation. That from this city of Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem, these living rivers, these living waters. In Revelation, we see a picture of the waterhead being the throne of God. Just like in Genesis, there is one waterhead. And then in Genesis and in Revelation was split up into various branches. The idea of living waters probably parallels what Revelation says, that the trees that grow by that river, even their leaves are for the healing of the nations. They bring life. And perhaps an echo of the tree of life that must have grown near that original waterhead, wherever that was. And so those two trees in the Garden of Eden would have been side by side around that original waterhead. In Revelation, there will be only one tree, but the tree will have trunks on both sides of the waterhead, from which the river of life would flow and then branch out to refresh the world. This is a magnificent picture that ties the original primordial creation with the final eschatological creation or new creation of God, giving us one of the strings that binds the Bible together, and that is the Garden of Eden. And so this is highly significant prophecy because it's not only about Jesus at that point in time, but Jesus at the very end point in time. Somebody wrote to me last week who, I'm not sure if he's a pastor, a young pastor, or just a lay person from Sabah. He was having a hard time to wrap his mind around the three appearances of Christ in the New Testament. He said, I can really see only two advents. So I had to give him a lengthy reply that the first advent is when Jesus came, involving the nativity, the passion, and so on. The second advent is when he comes to claim the redeemed, but hasn't fully solved the problem of sin. The third coming is with the New Jerusalem, when the redeemed will come back to the earth and the problem of sin is resolved and a new creation happens and the living waters that were part of the original creation will flow once again. It's amazing that Zechariah saw all of these, not in as detailed a picture as John, and yet Adventists have never really paid attention to how Zechariah and John are so closely linked together. By John, I mean the book of Revelation, but also to some extent the gospel itself. The Gospel of John does not quote Old Testament very much. That one phrase cited from Zechariah is one of the few that is cited. So John clearly spent a lot of time studying Zechariah as he was attempting to communicate, to write down his own visions in the book we call Revelation. So I think it's time for Adventists to see the importance of this linkage between Zechariah and Revelation. We saw that with Ezekiel, but we're seeing it very, very much here, particularly in this later part of the book. So verses 9 to 12 of Zechariah 14 says, Yahweh will then be king over all the earth. Yahweh will be seen as one with a single name, and there will be complete transformation of the land. This is almost priming us for that final transformation of the land, when God will create a new heavens and a new earth. Revelation 22 speaks about that amazing transformation that comes about once the land has been cleansed of sin, once the universe and the planet have been cleansed of sin. Imagine a world so pristine, like the first world before the serpent appeared in the garden. Imagine a world that will be even more glorious, because in that first creation, we have a garden as the home of humans. In the new creation, we have the city, the garden city, the New Jerusalem for God's people. Now, when you compare Genesis with Revelation, you find many elements that were present in that original creation reappear in the New Jerusalem. The difference is a city instead of a garden, but the city is a garden city. And it's amazing that Zechariah, who's near the end of the Old Testament period, just one more prophet, and after this, the Old Testament period shuts down for 400 years. Zechariah provides the link between Genesis to Zechariah and then on to Revelation, so that a competent student of the Bible, a diligent student of the Bible, would have seen that the plan of God was disrupted to some extent by sin, but the idea of creating a world with beings that are just like himself will be fulfilled. And the ones that will live or that will come down in that New Jerusalem, they are not only redeemed, but they are perfected beings. See, Adam and Eve were perfect beings, but they lost that perfection. The inhabitants of the New Jerusalem, they will have regained that perfection. Adam and Eve were forbidden to re-enter the garden in Eden, and the reason is that to deprive them of access to the tree of life. Here in the New Jerusalem, they will have access. So it's not that there's some magical property in the water or in the trees, but no, there is no more second tree. There's only one tree. It's like a canopy across that head of water from which all the living waters would flow and transform the land. If you go back and read the transformation of the land in Zechariah 14, here in these verses, compare that with Revelation 22 and so on, you'll find a tremendous amount of similarity. It's the most, apart from Isaiah, it's the most descriptive piece of literature we have about that transformation of the land until we get to Revelation itself. So both Isaiah 65, 66, Zechariah 14, Revelation 21 and 22, they speak about the same reality. So clearly, when we get to this last oracle, this last prophecy of Zechariah, it's way out into the future. It's very eschatological. It's towards the end. So Bayom Hahu is that ending time when God will rule over the earth. Now, the first known hymn of the Christian church is recorded by Paul in Philippians chapter 2. And there is a line in that hymn that Christians have known for 2,000 years. Many have memorized. It appears in several hymns. It is used in prayers. It's recited. And that is this, that in Bayom Hahu, now I'm putting Hebrew words into Paul's writings, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Daniel, and particularly Revelation, tell us that sin originated as a challenge against Christ, against this member of the Godhead that we know of as Jesus Christ. The war, Revelation 12, that began in heaven between Michael and the dragon. By the way, Michael means one who is like God, or it could be a question, who is like God? The medieval church, based primarily on the book of Enoch, developed the idea that, apocryphal book, by the way, that Michael is the name of one of the archangels in heaven. The other one is Gabriel, that we know. They ended up naming two more that appeared in the book of Enoch, Raphael and Uriel. But in the scriptures that we have it, the canonical scriptures, take out the apocryphal books, Michael is a name for Christ. Appears in only 3 places, Daniel, Revelation, and Jude. And in all places, it has an eschatological, apocalyptic ending war. Interestingly, in all 3 places, Michael is at war. This is the time in heaven when that being we know as Hellel in Hebrew, or Lucifer in Latin, rebelled against God with the intention of, I will be like the Most High. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. And that's the exact temptation that he brought into the Garden in Eden, where he would try to convince Eve and Adam that if you eat this fruit, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. In other words, another way of reading the Hebrew is you will be godlike. You will be gods. I was listening to a YouTube guy. He's Iranian who has left Islam and became a Christian and then left Christianity and now just calls himself a spiritual person. And there in his speech, he makes this statement, which is symptomatic of all the Eastern religion, New Age movement. He says that, God is really in me. This is the old pantheistic idea that God is in everything. So God is in me. One of the greatest proponents of the New Age movement actually made the statement. She said that God lives in me, so I am God. The Bible has a very different vision of God. A God who is so other that he is nothing like his creation. He is so apart from his creation that we can never really comprehend him. And yet one who has chosen to live among his creation and then elevate them to live in his home. So the last promise in John is Jesus saying, I'm making a new home for you. Where I am, there you will be. The new home is New Jerusalem. You see, Christians have also believed for 2,000 years that we're going home to heaven. The Bible does not have that picture anywhere. Even in Revelation, heaven is a place of vacation. And it's not even a holiday vacation, it's a working vacation. After 1,000 years, we will return and earth will be remade, will be recreated. Sin will be totally purged, never to arise again. The universe restored to its pristine primordial creation and beyond. And that's our home. But in Revelation, what's different is this. In Genesis, God would come into the garden to talk with Adam and Eve. In Revelation, in this new creation, this new Jerusalem, God will live there. Heaven, earth becomes heaven in a manner of speaking, because God will move his house, so to speak, to this planet. And all this is to take place in the same piece of earth where the Garden of Eden may have been situated, where the Bible stories and the gospel stories and the first appearance of Christ and the nativity and the passion of Christ all took place, where his final coming back will also take place. It's very intriguing that the New Testament teaches that during the second advent, Jesus will not set foot on the earth again. He only sets foot on the earth twice. The first time as a human, the second time as a conquering king to destroy sin. And you know, Zechariah saw all this happening. He saw all this centuries before John did, approximately 500 years before John saw. And so I think we need to re-examine how we approach Revelation. That maybe instead of going from Revelation backwards, we need to go from the New Testament down into Revelation. So in these later chapters of Zechariah, in this final oracle of Zechariah, we find more prophecies that are fulfilled and encapsulated in the final prophecies of Revelation than any other book. There's this concentration that even Isaiah did not have of things relating to that new reality. But before that, there is a great war that ensues. Same thing in Revelation. There's a great war called the War of Gog and Magog in Revelation 20 before the recreation of the world. And in this war, the nations will rise up against Israel, and then they will fight against each other. God will cause confusion, similar to the vision in Ezekiel 38 to 39. This vision says that there will be plague in the enemy camps that would have reminded them of Egypt from the Exodus, and that the enemy survivors, and this is interesting, so this is not referring probably to the Gog and Magog, but more the Armageddon, 3 battles in the book of Revelation, heaven, Armageddon, Gog and Magog, that these survivors who then choose to worship God will be received into the kingdom. But those who turn their backs on God will receive proportionate punishment. And so this is the final probation, if you like, to use Adventist lingo, where there will be a point in time that people of the world will be given a final choice to choose God or not to choose God, to choose to follow the God of Israel, the God of Jerusalem, or something else. And this will come about as a result of war. So the The close of probation, by the way, if we understand Zechariah correctly and then understand the New Testament from his eyes, is Armageddon, not something else. I think that many Adventists who push the idea of close of probation may have gotten this wrong, because we see the close of probation not in relationship so much to Armageddon, but as pre-Armageddon. Whereas if we understand Zechariah correctly, this seems to be the battle he's speaking of here, Armageddon. So maybe not so much Revelation 20, but maybe Revelation 16. They will receive proportionate response. The fact that there is response both ways means that there is choice. And then finally, in Bayom Hahu are the results. And these are written in almost poetic beauty. It says that the bells of the horses will bear the inscription, Holy to the Lord. This is amazing because only one person in the entire history of the Old Testament was allowed to carry this title, and that was the high priest. He wore a golden headband, and on that golden headband were inscribed these words, Holy to the Lord. Now, in this new reality, even the horses and the bells of the horses will carry that inscription. What a change of concept. Then something very homely for somebody who spends a lot of time in the kitchen. This is nice. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah will become holy in the sight of the Lord. This is similar to a prophecy in Jeremiah where what humans see is just a simple clay jar, but in God's sight, it is something special. Paul does the same thing in Corinthians, the idea of clay jars, but which are really high treasure to God. And then the third one, which needs to be understood from Genesis, interestingly, is this. There will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of Yahweh Sebaoth. By the way, the article there is redundant, sorry. No longer a Canaanite in the house of Yahweh Sebaoth. When you go back to Genesis 10 and 11, you discover something amazing. In chapter 10 of Genesis, as Moses wrote the Table of Nations, coming from the three sons of Noah. So from Japheth come all the northern and western nations, basically what we call the European races or the Caucasian races. From Ham come a mixture, mostly in Africa, but also in the Middle East. From Shem comes mostly the Middle East people. And then over the thousands of years, human migration and movement would create other races as we go along. But here's the thing. One of these races, because the names of the sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of Noah are national names or people names, people group names, not personal names. One of those people groups, son, the final son of Ham, is cursed by God. And we are told that Ham did something terrible. There's so much debate among scholars about what Ham did. Noah got drunk, and it says that Ham saw his nakedness. And then Noah wakes up and curses Canaan. And then Canaan is listed as the progenitor of the people we know as the Canaanites. And they are the ones who are under a divine curse. So when Israel was brought back from Egypt, one of the commands of God is that the Canaanites must be removed from the land, because that is the only way you can remove that curse. It's almost like a symbol of the curse of sin. The Israelites were never able to do it. Judah was never able to do it. Modern day Israel and the Jews are still not able to do. The people who would like to believe they are descendants of the Canaanites, but really they are not. Okay, they're just Arabs. However, almost all Arabs alive today are descendants of Ham. And so my contention is that one of the reasons God brought Abraham to that particular place is because this is the place where the cursed people, all the way back in Genesis, all the way back in the flood story, would live. And so the curse has to be reversed by the blessing. Notice what God says to Abraham, that I will give you many blessings. You will have many nations. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. And then there's a phrase in Genesis 12 where God says, be a blessing. Most translations have said, and you will be a blessing. But the Hebrew is imperative, be a blessing. You've come to the land of curses. Now you have to be the blessing. This is where salvation begins again. This is where humanity is given another start. And so Abraham ends up being called in the New Testament the father of faith by none other than Paul, Romans chapter 4. And so what Zechariah is saying here is this, that curse that was placed on the human race right after the flood, on a segment of the human race, that curse will be removed. No longer a Canaanite in the house of Yahweh Sebaoth. And in Revelation, we see the fulfillment of that, where anybody who is not in the house of Yahweh Sebaoth, who is not in the New Jerusalem, would be burned in the lake of fire, and they would be destroyed. This is the climax of the book of Zechariah. Holy to the Lord, inscribed on common things like horse bells, not just on high priests. Simple household articles becoming holy in God's sight and precious. These are metaphors, by the way. And no more Canaanites. This is the equivalent of Revelation saying no more sin in this new reality. All this will happen as a consequence of the war. So I believe there's a conflation between Armageddon and Gog and Magog of Revelation here in Zechariah, all happening in Bayom Hahu. And that brings us to the end of the book. God will create a new world. Revelation is not the first place where we meet this. The first place is Isaiah. The second place is Zechariah. What's the importance of that? Isaiah lived about 150 years before the exile, as the nation descends into that punishable act of God. Zechariah lives right after the returning from the exile, as the nation is being given a new start. And then both have been shown that it's not just the history that matters, not just the physical Jerusalem or the physical land of Israel, but the ultimate spiritual eschatological ending. But again, geolocated in one particular spot. That never changes in Bible history. It's quite amazing that from Genesis to Revelation, we can probably mark the spot where the land of God exists. Because you see, when God created humans, He did not give them the entire planet as home. They were to govern the planet. Yes, that was their work, their mission. He gave them a home within that planet, a specific spot, a specific place from which human life would begin. Now, when the flood story took place, God made a different command to the descendants of Noah. Don't stay in any one spot, go all over the place. You know where they chose to go? The Shinar. That's where Babylon is. That's where Babylon was built. Nimrod, a descendant of Ham, was the man who built both Babylon and Nineveh. So Babylon is a city built by the cursed son of Noah from the earliest of times. They decided to settle there. And Abraham also was from the valley of Shinar. So God brought Abraham out of there to the real land of promise, and that was Canaan, or the land of Israel. When the Jews failed, God sent them right back into Shinar, and then through Cyrus brought them back there. When Jesus was born, I've thought about it as I was writing this article. God could have sent Abraham anywhere, Greenland, Siberia, somewhere in the world where there were no people, and Abraham would have to fight his way through. To survive, Abraham had his own private militia. That was the kind of land God sent him to, a war-ridden land. Think of any major empire around the world, from ancient Egypt until the British Empire, they've all trampled on that land. They've all trampled on God's land. The Muslim armies, the Ottoman Turks, The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Hittites, the Romans, the Greeks, all of them have trampled that land. And yet God sends his son to that land when it was under the worst of those accusers against Israel. Okay. And then when he returns to destroy all of the enemies, all of the sinful enemies of his kingdom, he will come back to that land. But the whole earth will be transformed. Zechariah, Isaiah, Revelation all say the same thing. And so these prophecies have to be examined together. The fact that 3 times in 3 different eras, we have prophecies about this new heaven, new earth, the transformation of the land, separated by centuries between each time. Isaiah, Zechariah, Revelation tells us that this is really, really important to God. The restoration of that original creation and then elevating it to an even higher level. All right, as is my pattern, we will take a break for a while I ponder where to go next, and you can make suggestions in the meantime. Maybe for a couple of weeks, I will let you know when we resume.